Shall we get started?
Yeah, I was wondering there was one thing that I thought of over the course of the week that if it's all right, I just wanted to go back and just elaborate on real quickly.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe just ask a question about it, which is uh, so we 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 def- we tried we put a little bit of time into uh, defining AI and AGI. We didn't necessarily, create anything definitive there, but we talked through some ideas. And we distinguished a few things there. We distinguished superintelligence from artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. I shared my own personal sort of three category schema, which is narrow artificial intelligence, uh, uh, general artificial intelligence that isn't sapient or isn't agentic, it isn't self-aware, and then sort of the classic artificial intelligence idea of artificial general intelligence that is sapient and is self-aware and does act like an agent with motives and goals and so forth. Okay. Well, one other thing that we mentioned in the context of that conversation very briefly was collective intelligence or group intelligence. I wanted to return to this, just circle back to this very quickly, because there is this question of what exactly is it about coordination across domains of competence that distinguishes sort of a singleton, a single system versus a collection or collective. So what is it that makes a single intelligence that's generally competent different than a collection of narrowly competent intelligences? And it seems like the close coordination across different domains of competence is sort of implicit in an agentic, sapient, general intelligence, like a human being, for example. Because to whatever extent an individual human being develops competencies, and they can range very widely, obviously. There's close coordination across those. So I know how to drive a car, and I can walk, and I can ride a bicycle, and I can swim, and I can type on a computer. But all of those things are competences or domains of well, yeah, I mean, I'm broadly speaking intelligent and competent in those different ways. But what makes that different than one person who knows how to drive and that's it, one person who knows how to swim, one person who can use a computer, and it seems like it has something to do with coordination, latency, that sort of thing. So there's that. There's that. That's my sort of the first observation, and I guess it's also an open question for, but more an observation really that's open for comment. Then to just follow up on that very quickly and add to it, um, uh, I think I would then point to the possibility of that second category, a general artificial intelligence that is capable in many domains. The question I would ask there is, um, uh, what would we expect an effort or a single, either a single system or an effort to accumulate competencies under one organization's control, let's say? What would that look like? In other words, even if you didn't have sort of a singleton in the human sense or in the agentic or sapient sense, you could still imagine a generally competent system. In other words, a system that has lots of individual competencies, and it could effectively be a collection of narrow intelligences or competencies. So it could be a collective intelligence, but if it were coordinated closely enough, if we were sort of if there was some effort made to interconnect and coordinate uh, uh, those capacities, that maybe could happen just organizationally. And here I'm thinking of the big corporations like Google and Apple and others, the big tech companies. But what would a program look like? What would an effort? What would a project looked like organizationally. It was trying to basically gather, collect as many of these AIs, narrow AIs, as many as these narrow competencies as possible, basically all under one roof, and then coordinate them. And what would that look like? And even if it were not an agent, if it were just would it look different than the collective intelligence that humans achieve through large organizations or multiple organizations across say an entire industry or an entire economy, or does this look like something closer to an agent but still not quite? And I hope I'm being clear here, because it occurred to me that there may be a new and separate category that we should talk about or think about that might be relevant, that's already happening, and it may have a novel role to play in sort of the intelligence ecosystem, as it were.
Yeah, I think on the first point, the the term in the definition of general intelligence that I think accounts for this is the focus on goals. So when you say that an agent is generally intelligent if it's able to achieve a wide range of goals in diverse environments. So a goal is a high-level thing like prepare a meal, and that is made up of many subtasks. And I think it's implicit that a big part of what it means to be generally intelligent is the ability not only to decompose a given goal into subtasks and structure them in some sort of hierarchy in time and space, and then executing each individual subtask and integrating them, I suppose you could view as, even in our own intelligence, maybe delegated to subunits. Things like physical movement is below our level of conscious attention. You could say that's a subtask, and within the task of moving my arm is many further subtasks that are kind of automated from my point of view. But that's right. I think general intelligence is about achieving a wide range of goals, and achieving goals has as an important and perhaps decisive component the ability to deconstruct goals and then execute them and kind of bring the results together. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think we may have talked in the past, Adam, about the KAIS model from Drexler. So CAIS, what does that stand for? Collection of AI systems, perhaps, or services. So this is an alternative model of a AI-enabled future where... Sorry?
I think it's comprehensive AI.
Comprehensive. That makes more sense, yeah. So this is a model where there are many more narrow AI systems that are integrated in a way that the integration itself maybe isn't highly automated. Maybe there's more humans in the loop, or it's in some sort of market, or anyway, it's not like a single server that's kind of passing signals with high bandwidth between its components. This seems, in my view, to be basically already ahistorical somehow. So the way that modern AI systems are achieving breakthrough performance is by building on top of very powerful foundation models, which are trained on a large amount of very varied data, often across different kinds of modalities like text or images. And it's the sort of integration of those different sources and the scale that makes them as capable as they are. I'm not sure it's... So there's such a power to the general training and then fine-tuning on top of that maybe the paradigm will shift, but that makes so much sense and has worked so dramatically that I find it very unlikely that there is a future in which that kind of KAIS model, apart from some sort of top-down diktat on safety grounds that you shall not build general AI models that are, not somehow narrowly tailored and therefore safe. Absent that kind of top-down regulation, it seems highly unlikely to me that that's going to be a realistic path forward. But yeah, I guess on that final point, you maybe are talking about something like emergent agency, where maybe there's no like conscious agent, but a system behaves as though it has agency. Uh, like you could say, corporations maybe already behave that way. Is that sort of what you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean the it, I suppose they do have something analogous to agency to these, but I wasn't really thinking, my mind wasn't really going that direction. I was really reaching more towards what this uh, case model is. That was where my mind was going. And I, I guess the I guess the question that really emerges out of that is, to what extent the achievement of goals that are that require generalization. In other words, the achievement of goals in the context of significant novelty. Um, uh, to what extent that requires something more than just a collection of separate competencies in a number of narrower domains. Um, and what I mean by that is I guess this just gets to this question of, is it necessary to be an agent? Is it necessary have uh, to have some capacity to recursively model one's self in the context of all of one's goal seeking in order to solve, some types of problems in some situations, presumably uh, uh, those problems, or achieve some goals, in some situations that are characterized by a lot of novelty. And I guess that's an open question.
Could we contrast here,
So
say, a
yeah,
collection of humans working together collaboratively, each one of which is a general agent, but which is kind of fine tuned to some specific task for reasons of optimization and division of labor, as compared to, say, an ant colony where maybe each individual ant is not a general agent. Arguably, there is no real general agent there, perhaps. But certainly, any individual ant isn't capable of really comprehending the tasks that are being executed by the hive and just does its little part. You could say that's like a narrow intelligence deployed as part of a collective in a way that achieves goals that no individual in the collective could really even apprehend. A human collective, each individual, maybe still in the large organization, you don't really understand what the hell is going on, but somehow in principle it seems more tractable that an individual could get the aim and maybe could execute it just very slowly or more poorly. But somehow there's a difference between these two kinds of agglomeration. Would you agree?
absolutely. I think that's a crucial distinction, and it is. I think it's a problem embedded in the definition of collective intelligence that at least as far as I normally see it described and discussed, it's collections of human beings. So it's collections of general intelligences, or generally, or well, yeah, I mean, or another way to think about it is it's collections of agents, and uh, and it I suppose, well, it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that you can have, say, if you take for example a company or corporation, um, you can have a corporation that this gets back to your earlier question. Do large organizations have agentic properties? And it's a little bit ironic. It seems that, that to even be asking that question, it seems like there are some circumstances in which you could argue that organizations of agents then don't behave in an agentic way. Like the collective intelligence seems sort of dumb in a sense, even if it's got, a number of uh, you know even if it has a collection of competencies because of the humans it's comprised of, the organization itself can be pretty dumb, not very self-aware, maybe bumbling along, maybe making some mistakes, maybe pursuing goals that don't really make any sense, that none of the that a properly intelligent agent wouldn't necessarily agree to pursue, and so forth. So there's some strange things going on with collections of intelligences, and it's one reason why I wanted to kind of, I didn't mean to derail the conversation that we really want to have today, but I am genuinely confused about how to make sense of this, because it seems like you've got, at different levels of organization, you have you have general intelligence, and then you put a bunch of those together and you get a collective intelligence, but somehow it's not general anymore, and it isn't an agent anymore, and it can be dumber in some key ways. But then possibly on the flip side, you could have something more like this case model, where you're putting a bunch of dumb things together and maybe generality emerges and something more like agentism emerges. Maybe that's a possibility. It just seems like I really am confused as to what the rules are here. It seems like any and all combinations are possible, and we're seeing all sorts of different things. Maybe that's the lesson to draw, is that there is no strictly speaking, a rigid hierarchy from which above which certain things emerge and below which certain things don't exist. It seems like it's maybe more fluid than that. But I find this a bit confusing as a basis from which to draw any conclusions about the emergence of artificial general intelligence of either the non-agentic, non-sapient kind or the agentic sapient kind. Because we look at collective intelligences and it seems like, anything goes. So
I think that's right. I think that's indicative of what the finish line looks like. Is it just kind of disaggregates into a mess that it's hard to tell when we're going to cross that line or not. So here's one scenario that Andre Karpathy just did a podcast with Lex Fridman. It's quite interesting. I found the first, I don't know how long it is, maybe 2 hours or so. The early part, maybe the first 3 quarters, I didn't find very interesting, but there's a quite interesting exchange near the end. So Andre is talking about the Codex model, which you can use on GitHub Copilot. Codex is a closely related thing. Copilot on GitHub, which is a assistive coding model that you can helps you write code, being very widely used now. It's not perfect, but people find it useful. There's similar internal projects in Google and elsewhere. And it's just a single model that looks at your code and proposes extensions to it. And you write comments in natural language and it attempts to write code that achieves them and so on. But Andre was speculating about how, well, you'd have one model that's proposing code and then another model that's more specialized in finding bugs, and that would pay attention to the outputs of the first model, and then you might have a third model that is checking to see if it compiles correctly and executes to do the desired job, and then an overall kind of manager model that will integrate the outputs of all of those. And that does seem like a plausible trajectory that will happen quite soon. I'm not sure that's exactly what the Kais model has in mind, but maybe it's kind of conceptually similar. And that makes a lot of sense. You get a lot of advantages to training on a large data set, but there's still value to specialization. And in that kind of system, when would it cross the line to being a kind of general intelligence? Well, if it's just limited to code, then you could say it never will. But at some point, maybe there's a mix of these systems communicating, adjudicating one another's outputs in some complicated way. And it's never quite clear when this barrier of general intelligence falls. It'll just be kind of clear that within some fairly broad domain like coding, we've crossed some threshold to be, maybe it won't be like Tuesday it's not there and Wednesday it is there. It'll be like on Tuesday there are 5% of all the programmers in the world basically offload a set of tasks to this kind of model, which they would have previously hired an assistant to do. And so there's like, basically it's kind of general because it's replacing a general agent, which is a human, but only within the task of programming. But still, that's a very broad task and so on. So there'll be this kind of like creeping generality that probably it's, by the time it's here, people will be used to it for some. It won't be a decisive moment, I suppose, is my impression.
That's really interesting. I just wanted to go back to what you were saying, Adam, about like dumb companies. It just really quite ironic and funny that we talk about, if you have a job that you don't really like, you might speak about it as if you're like a cog in a machine. So I wonder if like somehow when a kind of company is like, functioning in a dumb way, it's kind of not really using the sort of general intelligent capabilities of the people who make it up, right? So you feel like it's somehow working more like a computer, like you feel like you're a kind of bit or something, or just a little mechanism, like you're just doing your little thing. You don't really see what's going on, and so I suppose that the way that the sort of the coordination and the sort of systems design is really crucial in terms of what the outcomes are.
Yeah, that's really interesting from a historical perspective too, right? Because in the sort of early days of the Industrial Revolution, and very famously, a century or more into the Industrial Revolution, with Henry Ford, being the quintessential example of the assembly line where human beings were just reduced to performing a single task. You had a deliberately conscious effort to take the agency out of the human beings, really dehumanize them and alienate them from their own labor, and or alienate them as in the process of the division of labor. And that's fascinating. That I suppose there were significant advantages to especially trying to scale production in an organization, to removing the agency from the individual constituents. But I suppose that we were effectively trying to build a machine. I guess the fancy way of saying it would be some cybernetic machine, but we were trying to basically build a machine in the form of an organization to achieve some goal, to perform some function, assemble automobiles in this case, and you were having human beings perform very mechanized, very mechanical functions that were specifically designed to be sort of minimally intelligent. That's a really, really interesting way of looking at it. Just from a historical perspective. And then now, it depends on the organization, of course, but if we then fast forward another century and we think of the big tech companies, when you're trying to engineer software or do something that's very intellectually challenging, maybe there's a different set of, because it's a different set of challenges and different kind of requirements of intelligence that we're asking, then we return to a situation. Ironically, it's a little more analogous to the pre-industrial era, where we hope each person is exercising some of their agency and using their generality of intelligence to bring that value to the service of the organization's goals as a whole. Which, of course, is like what that's what you would do if you were an apprentice building carriages, as opposed to and learning every task and solving every problem that came along and helping with the family business, as opposed to just twisting one wrench on a production line, right? It's a weird. There's a weird circle that's being traversed there somehow. Hey, it's wild.
I think you might think too highly of programming work, but yes, it may not be that different to working on a production line. I think in practice, at least at some level.
I do have one more thought, and that is so just bear with me here with the thought experiment. But imagine Google or Alphabet, or Apple or any of these big companies that's working on this. I'm thinking Google and DeepMind. So say they are assembling a large collection of narrow AI competencies. And let's say that collection becomes quite large, dozens or hundreds or thousands of narrow competencies. And we can fast forward in time of, a few years to whenever this thought experiment makes sense. But does there come a point where you need a higher level, not high level, what's the right way? Really a managerial or executive function whose job is to choose among the narrow AIs for how to accomplish some task and to coordinate their activities. So say you have a novel goal that comes along, and I know this will sound a little bit agentic, but say you have a novel goal that comes along, you want to solve it, and you think you sort of have the capacity to do that with the toolbox of narrow AIs that you've got, but you've got to pick and choose. You've got to kind of coordinate them a bit. You've got to get them to do the right things. You've got to get them to talk a little bit to one another so that the findings and results out of one then are output out of one or input into the other and so forth. Right now, it seems like if you were to take advantage of narrow intelligence in an organization, human beings would be doing that process. They would be, okay, well, I use this tool here and that tool there and that tool over there, much as we do with any other tool. And then you sort of, outputs from one or inputs to another, and you get your results that you accomplish your goals that way. And I'm wondering at what point do we create another layer, a coordinating or managerial or executive kind of function layer whose job it is to facilitate that coordination, to make decisions and to wire things up together. How many? Well, that's the first thing, and then I suppose the second thing is when and where and how does that cease to be distinguishable from an agent?
Yeah, maybe you'd be interested to know how the cutting edge of robotics looks. So the cutting edge of robotics, as far as I understand it, is that they take large language models and large vision models. They're trained separately. And then there's various demos of this, I think, from Google and elsewhere. So these models are kind of together joined to form the brain of the robot, you give it a task, for example, go get me a drink from the fridge. The language model is then sort of given this sentence and asked to figure out what it means and how those ingredients combine together to solve the problem, to perform the task. But the robot has to see and navigate in the real world. So the vision model is kind of mapping those objects in the real world onto the internal language that the language model understands. And together they're coordinated by, at this point, a human written piece of code that glues them together. And that together forms the kind of agent. So yeah, that is what you're describing is the present day of how cutting edge robotics works. There's no reason to think that handwritten integration component won't at some point also be learned. The intermediation layer would be the kind of internal language that both models have sort of learned to communicate in this case, the dictionary of tokens that transformers understand. But yeah, that it hasn't happened yet, I think, but certainly you would expect that layer to itself be learned at some point. So I find that very plausible, yeah.
What kind of data would that layer be learning from, do you imagine?
Well, it would be
trained on.
It would be trained on, so you could imagine a kind of reinforcement learning loop where the vision and the language model components are pre-trained and fixed. And then you would have an agent whose job it is to kind of coordinate those two, so sort of translate from one to the other, and use that coordination in order to achieve some goal, and you would give it rewards based on whether those goals were achieved or not in simulation, most likely. So that would be how you would train that outer loop, by reinforcement learning. So you'd have these kind of components which may have something in common. They may have been jointly trained to some extent, but you would reward an agent for their ability to communicate or facilitate communication among those components and integrate them to achieve some kind of goal.
Interesting. Okay, cool.
That's interesting, because I mean, when you're describing that, Dan, it sounds like a lot how I imagine the human brain to work.
Yes.
And like in the case of a robot, we're dealing with a kind of system that has a kind of body. So it's sort of easy to imagine how, like if you wanted to train it to move boxes around a factory, you can just get it to do that thing. And you have some sort of reinforcement process, and eventually it learns to do that. But I suppose maybe it's a little harder for me to imagine how that would happen. I suppose you need to define the sort of generality of the sort of the problem domain that you would be looking at. But I mean, I suppose it's the same principle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a question of difficulty. So reinforcement learning is a very difficult learning problem, because take the example of a robot. So if the task is fetch me something from here or there, or move a box from there to here, that's made up of many individual subtasks, and the reward is very sparse. So you might have to take thousands or tens of thousands of actions before you get a signal that says you did it correctly or not, which is why this early progress in things like AlphaGo with reinforcement learning really didn't go very far. So deep reinforcement learning has not stalled exactly, but it's not the place where rapid gains are being made, which is why now people are returning to these problems, but with the arsenal of these large pre-trained models that are much easier to train. So it's much easier to train just the piece that understands your instructions and maps that to some kind of internal language, and the piece that knows how to see, and then have like a separate loop which on top of those can then learn how to perform instructions that you give it. And that seems to be the model that people are moving forward with very rapidly in robotics. So yeah,
it does sound a lot like, I mean, it just intuitively, it like Owen said, it really does strike me as concordant with how I imagine my own brain working. The yeah, I guess I suppose this is an older domain of, reinforcement learning's been around a while. I'm sure this is well-trodden territory, but when a person has a goal and doesn't know how to achieve it, there's a lot of trial and error. And it's pretty clear when you don't succeed in a goal. It's sometimes less clear whether you're making incremental progress towards successfully achieving a goal or not. I mean, sometimes that's clear for certain tasks. You can tell, oh, well, I am inching closer to being successful at this. But there are other tasks where it's really hard to tell if you're getting if your strategy is working at all. Like, is it in other words, I think there's a difference between goals to which there's a clear continuous gradient of that you can traverse, and then there are goals where it just seems like you have to take big leaps across obstacles, the actual success may lie a few peaks away and may not even be visible at all from where you are. And I'm not completely clear how that maps to machine learning. And human beings seem to be able to do some of those leaps with the help of imagination and dogged trial and error
Oh,
and
but
so forth. But,
very rarely. No, I mean, you're talking about incentive design and the whole problem of management and organizational persistence, and this is some of the hardest things that humans do, right? No, we are terrible at this. Yeah, this is a very hard problem and likely to be one of the key places where humans are contributing to AI systems until it becomes completely automated, specifying loss functions and how to provide reward in a way that's informative. You know, when we're inside organizations, this is what we interact with, right? Our incentive system. What gets me a promotion? There's a list of stuff, tick or not. Who designs that? Well, whoever designs that incentive system, the loss function that we're kind of optimizing for, if we're careerist, conformist people, that loss function determines, everything. Very, very careful design is necessary to engineer the outcomes that you think are desirable. So yeah, this is a hard problem. It's hard for people. It will be hard at the beginning for machines, but ultimately they will learn this part as well, as is already. I mean, that's kind of what's happening when you provide sparse rewards to a capable system. So internally, a deep reinforcement learning system is somehow figuring out how these sparse rewards, like win or loss, translate into signals that are more appropriate for the components that make up the algorithm. We don't understand how that translation really works, but that's clearly what's happening at some level inside. It's learning how to, in an organization, it would be something like the executives, their job supposedly is to translate increases in sales, like that signal, what's responsible for that signal? How do you translate that success or failure into actions internally? How do you map the external signals onto the internal incentive system? That's why they're supposed to earn the big bucks, I presume.
Yeah, supposed to. I think that
I fully believe that there's deep competence in doing that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that competence is well. I mean, this is another funny thing is that we reward systems get corrupted, and you have multiple layers of reward and hidden incentives, and all the game theory kind of good fun stuff. And you see it in all big corporations. Wall Street is famous for it, for rewarding all the sorts of the wrong things, but yeah, how do you solve a problem that you just that you've never encountered before, that's really hard, that there isn't a clear sequence of steps that will get you to success. This is very like, how do you do research? How do you do R&D on a new to develop a new to create new knowledge, or to develop a new product or service, and figure out how to actually do that successfully? It's super, super difficult, and a lot of leaps of faith involved, and I guess leadership, executives and management, they're making guesses, hoping that will, I guess ultimately you're exploring some possibility space, right? And as you bumble and flail around blindly in the dark and try to remember where you've been and what you've encountered, to try to make progress. But yeah, sometimes it's tough. For hard problems, super, super, super duper tough. Anyway, yeah.
Shall we segue into the advertised topic? That was
yeah, sure.
Okay, let me just take a look at this board and see where we were up to. Adam, could you move over here so I can get the org cam looking at this? Yeah, thanks. All right, so we were talking last time about 3 kinds of timelines: short, medium, long, and 3 groups: insiders, elites, by which I have in mind non-insiders, so not tech people, not people directly involved in building these systems or funding them, but the players who will seek to well, yeah, I guess there's a list there. I'll just leave it at that. And then there's the public, so everyone else. We discussed last time fairly extensively the view of the insiders, which arguably for some subset has already moved to short timelines. We got up to at the end talking about elites who maybe have shifted from long timelines or agnosticism towards perhaps medium timelines, thinking that we'll have general AI in something like 2 or 3 decades as compared to hundreds of years. That's where we left off. I'm not sure if we have more to say about elites. I think we want to maybe spend time talking about P, about the public category. Did you have more you wanted to add to the discussion last time? Anybody about elites and the medium timeline? I think we finished talking about the chip war, and I see a question there. Why not more? Yeah, maybe that's a good leaping off point. So I think it's very recent somehow, the shift in the elite opinion towards something like a medium timeline, and still isn't really consciously stated. I don't know that I think it's a kind of latent view that you can read in action, but maybe hasn't, in the collective intelligence of the political and economic elites, reached a conscious thought. I thought of one point of comparison that's maybe interesting, which is UFOs or UAPs or whatever socially acceptable acronym people use, which has gone through a very interesting kind of phase transition over the last few years from not really there being new information, although there's some new confirmation from more reputable sources, but it's not like there's actually that much new to know. But there's clearly a big shift in elite opinion and willingness to state that opinion on this topic, where now it's kind of the mainstream view, as you'll read in the New York Times, and intelligence officials will say it and military officials will say it, and there are congressional hearings, that there's definitely something going on that isn't weather balloons. They don't say it's little green men necessarily, but there's something going on, and it's not crazy to talk about it anymore. So it's not like the facts on the ground really shifted over the last few years. It's just the Overton window has moved a long way. So I think we're not quite there yet with AGI. I think if you were to stand up and write in the pages of the New York Times that, just in a very straightforward way that, get ready, the machines will be here in 20 years, maybe that would still be a little viewed as a little fringe. I don't know if you would agree with that perception, Adam.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think that the elites are in a different situation than the tech insiders, right? In that they have their positions of leadership, their positions of authority, their positions of power and influence across different measures and dimensions are, at least in some sense, contingent upon public approval. So the layer of elites and what they're able to espouse explicitly is contingent upon some sort of social sanction publicly, and there are certain things that are not that remain taboo, or that will likely invite ostracization and ridicule and so forth. And so even if the elites hold private beliefs, they aren't able to espouse those publicly, and so they aren't able to act on them in an overt manner. And we've seen this in other domains. Disruptions provide instructive examples. We talked last time about how the cultural, political, and economic elites can be informed by knowledge from insiders, but then the social pressures force them to be conservative and to adhere to a conservative consensus, rather than going out on a limb and staking or risking their reputation. For example, so yeah, there are lots and lots of examples of this We mentioned some last time. One I'll mention just again as a reminder, just very briefly, is the climate science community is notoriously conservative in its estimates, and there's a great fear of being alarmist in that community because of the political, the attachments to the issue, right? And so for the last generation, the climate science community, so that's 15 to 20 years or more, the climate science community has been very cautious about making claims, and will only make claims and standby claims that for which the evidence is overwhelming. And as a result, there's a consistent pattern that emerges, which is that the delta, in other words, the derivative of the projections going forward, only ever get worse, because the climate science community, the consensus, only defends claims for which the evidence is overwhelming, and in the interest and the incentive is to avoid alarmism. That consensus only ever underestimates the risk, and always errs on the side of making not positive or negative or optimistic or pessimistic claims, but only ever errs on the side of less climate change. That's what I'm looking for. Less climate change and less impact, rather than more climate change and more impact. And as a result, if you look at the delta, if you look at the change over the last 20 years, the predictions for climate change only ever get worse, and the scenario that emerges is usually as bad or worse than business as usual, or the worst case scenarios. And it never seems to go in the other direction. There never seems to be a shift to, oh, it's not as bad as we thought, guys. That never seems to happen, and that's because of the nature of the consensus and the incentives around it. And you described some other examples last time. So this elite layer is severely constrained in terms of its incentives and the consequences around being completely forthright, not honest, but just being forthright, like fully disclosing. And so disclosure, that's a word that's related to UFOs and UAPs, right? I think there's something called the Disclosure Project that's around getting the government to admit things. At any rate, this is definitely a pattern, and the public I think historically we've seen that the public has to, on some level, grant permission to move the Overton window so that certain conversations are allowable and certain claims can be made or possibilities entertained seriously. And right now, it does feel like the public is just not near that point with the short AGI scenario. I don't feel like my perception, and again, this is just subjective, but my perception is that the public is not even close to that yet. And maybe the public is inching from long towards medium. And a little bit of this perhaps is helped by science fiction's Hollywood stuff here and there, but it all is treated as if it's a long way off still. It's a remote possibility. It's just science fiction. The public does not, to my eye, seem to be taking this at all seriously on sort of a 10-year time horizon. So and until the public does that, I think we should expect the very few elites to stick their neck out on this.
How was Andrew Yang received? So Andrew Yang was a presidential candidate. Was that in 2016? I think so. Am I getting the name correct, Adam? You know who I'm talking
It's Andrew
about?
Yang, and it was 2020's election.
It was 2020, okay. So he was campaigning partly on a platform of caring deeply about automation and its effects, and he was explicitly talking about a universal basic income, UBI. I guess more generally, I'm interested in your take on how his message was received. But I'm also more generally, I guess, reaching for the point that it seems elite opinion shifts partly through this kind of entrepreneurship politically, right, where you'll have figures who stand up and kind of float a trial balloon to see if the public will follow them out on a limb and see something as important that maybe they didn't see before. And that seems to be how major parties often shift their opinion, or the Overton window shifts, is that you get these entrepreneurs who 90% of the time crash and burn, but then sometime when the time is right, they'll be the first to notice because they won't crash and burn, and then things happen. So yeah, actually one of the things I wanted to put up as the harbingers of the elite shift from medium to short would be the emergence of entrepreneurs of that kind. So maybe I'll do that while you give your reaction.
I think that's a great point. I completely agree with it. In my mind, Andrew Yang was sort of a tragic figure, and a tragic, very unfortunate, terrible loss certainly for the United States. If things had been just a little bit different. So the tragedy there with Andrew Yang specifically is he was one of the first people in a long time to run on an entirely pragmatic platform, really about problem solving. He's sort of brought very much. He's not an engineer, but he brought that kind of mindset to the task of policymaking, which was an enormous breath of fresh air for a lot of people. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people. The things that were tragic about the particular example of him is that he was simply not the right person to have that message. He wasn't quite successful enough, or famous enough, or experienced enough in any of the key ways that would have put him over the first big obstacles that he encountered. He did remarkably well considering he had minimal experience and notoriety and so forth. If, for example, Bill Gates had run on that identical platform with the identical messaging, he would have gone a lot further, because he has an unassailable track record as a technology person. And for all of his flaws, and yes, we can criticize him and so forth, the American public would have looked at someone who was monumentally successful in technology very differently than someone like Andrew Yang, who had not that impressive enough of a reputation. Similarly, if a very seasoned, very famous politician had come along with the exact same message, and I'm not even talking about somebody super famous like Obama or something. I'm talking about just somebody with a lot of political experience, maybe who'd been a contender at some point. In American politics, we have people like that in every election cycle. Probably the people, you could think of someone like Pete Buttigieg, who is a reasonably successful in the candidate, probably in the running for a presidential election in future years. If someone like him had come along who could be taken entirely seriously as a politician, who had the same message, that way it might have landed entirely differently. So, and then the last piece that makes Andrew Yang's case, I think, tragic is that he dropped out of the race only a few weeks before the pandemic really got going and the first wave of the pandemic emerged. And if he hadn't dropped out, his message about universal basic income would have resonated completely differently, because we basically did have a UBI for about a year in the United States, or something very close to it. The U.S. government, the federal government, started sending out checks to a significant fraction of the U.S. population. I don't know the exact numbers, and they weren't sending out equally sized checks. It ranged from about $500 to about $2,500 per month, depending on circumstances and family and so forth. I received some of those checks, so they were going out to a wide range of people with different incomes, and those checks went out the original plan was a few months, and then it got extended multiple times, and I think the program ended up being a year or more long. And if Andrew Yang had stayed in the race another month, all of that messaging about a universal basic income would have been relevant in a completely new way. And it was tragic, just that timing of that. So it could have gone very differently. There was an opportunity there for a better candidate, and maybe a little bit more luck, to completely change the conversation about technology and disruption and automation, and perhaps even now AGI, and certainly about policy responses like universal basic income. But that opportunity seems to have missed, and we haven't had a new candidate like that. Well, who knows if we'll get one? But I agree that I think that there is potential for entrepreneurs to occasionally, give the whole entire system enough of a shock that it really does instigate a shift. Having said that, I think we do need to be very wary of sort of the heroic figure of history, where we attribute the trajectory of human history to key actions of individuals. I think that's we probably do too much of that. I'm not saying that never happens, but
wait a minute.
My intuition is
you're not a Trump fan?
That's. Well, I think that it's we instinctively sort of point to individual actions by individual people, and we sort of attribute let's say we attribute heroic causation, and I think we probably do that too much. And there's a bit too much anthropomorphizing, and there's more of it is just system inertia and system behavior, and less of it is about individuals really making the entire system shift. But having said that, I don't dismiss that happens at all. I think that does happen, but we probably over attribute the actions of individuals causally to the direction of human systems. So anyway, that's my general take on it, and just bringing it back to this conversation. I absolutely agree that we seem to be at a fertile time for a new for one or more new figures to emerge that then gain traction in shifting the Overton window of the public, and thereby permitting the Overton window of the elites to move, supported by the authority of the experts at the insider level. And so with timing, the conditions seem ripe. It will be. I suppose it's interesting to ask the question: is there anything that we can do to advance this this process? Can we, in other words, is there some campaign of awareness creation that could be mounted that would be beneficial to humanity to making that shift sooner rather than later? And I work for an organization that believes that's possible. So.
Yeah, good luck.
Maybe universities fundamentally believe that too. I suppose they do.
Yeah, if they could only achieve such things. Could you move over to the other board so that I can take a look at this? Yeah, I wanted to add another name into this mix as a kind of prediction. So in a few years you can congratulate me on how clever I am. So Timnit Gebru, who I've mentioned before, this would be my prediction for a political figure to emerge on this topic within the next few years, with a wide platform and a significant voice in how these things turn out. So we don't have to talk about her again, but so she was, looking up her bio before this meeting, she was on 2022's Times influential list of the, 50 most or 100 most influential people. So for whatever that's worth, maybe that's already happened, but this name you will hear more of, I think. Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, is also very influential behind the scenes. I don't know to what degree you'd attribute all of the M to S shift among the political elites in the US, the L to M shift, to him specifically, but I think a big chunk of it could go to him. I think he's very active in the kind of government and military circles in explaining what's about to happen. So I haven't paid much attention to him, but I know there's some books that would go into more detail about that. I haven't read them, but that seems to be another figure to watch, I would think. Okay, so that's kind of one of the signs of the medium to short timeline shift. I wanted to just rattle off, for elites, I wanted to rattle off a few things that I think might make a difference or kind of punctuate the equilibrium a little bit, just as a kind of conversation starter. I think progress in robotics, which is likely to accelerate, partly for the reasons we were discussing earlier, could, as more general robotics kind of moves out of the sci-fi column into the column of things we actually see out there in the world, particularly in more varied forms of manufacturing. This could show up in GDP numbers and be something the elites care about. All of these, I suppose, could also go in the column of things that the public will pay attention to, but I think to begin with, it's not like the average member of the public cares so much about what goes on deep in the bowels of the manufacturing system, right? Not in the way that elites, particularly congressmen or whatever, will pay attention to what's happening in their districts and what moves the needle on employment figures and so on. So you could imagine elites caring about this more than the average member of the public, for sure. Major breakthrough treatments, I think, is another one that's going to be something that causes people to pay attention. Progress on things like fusion, which is already perhaps happening. It's a little hard to tell what's hype and what's not. New materials is an easy one to forecast. We're going to see a lot of progress in novel materials, things like, I don't know specifically if it's going to influence the yields on things like carbon nanotubes, but that kind of thing where you're getting new materials at scale that enable new kinds of applications, that'll be one of the signs that things are accelerating. And on a similar, I'm reading quite a few papers making use of AI to engineer new and exotic kinds of quantum states, highly entangled states with novel properties. That won't influence the economy, I would think. At least on the short timelines, won't make much of a difference, but it will be one of the research areas that gets people excited, I would think, over the next few years. I suppose there's military applications. What other triggers do you think exist, Adam, or anybody else, for this? According to our reading, this hasn't happened yet, right? Elites moving, or some significant minority or a majority moving from medium to short timelines. Short meaning within 10 years of today as the median prediction, the point estimate. So that puts 50% of the probability mass in the next decade, to be clear, right? So it's not that a short timeline means it's definitely happening by the end of the decade, but it means it's almost surely happening within the next 2 decades. That's a short timeline. You could be more aggressive than that, of course, but so what other triggers are we missing from this list?
Yeah, my team was talking about some of this, not purely related to artificial intelligence per se, but just as a general phenomenon. When is there a moment of realization for any individual person with sort of grokking the reality of a new technology and realizing that it's going to make a difference in their life? And a lot of times this goes back to sort of individual experiences with exposure to some new capability, right? So for many people, we can kind of remember the first time we had a smartphone in our hand, what that felt like, or the first time we, took a picture with a digital camera, or the first time we actually got online on the internet. In previous generations, people can remember the first time they flew in an airplane, the first time they rode in a car. And they just, oh wow, the world will never be the same. Now, and my life is recontextualized completely by an experience of this new technology. So what we could imagine, then, what technologies does AI touch that are likely to create an experience like that? A very obvious one to my mind is a form of robotics, which is the self-driving cars. Once a person gets into and rides a car, takes a car ride, where there's not a human driver, and it's a pretty seamless and fluid experience, I think that's going to be transformative for public awareness. this is, I mean, it's possible to take these kinds of rides in a handful of narrowly geofenced and weather permitting kind of areas. Like, you can technically do this in a few places, but we have not hit the sort of critical mass of that yet. But presumably that moment will come, and some large number of people will have that experience. I think we're already there with electric vehicles, where enough people have ridden in an electric car or driven in an electric car and just say, oh, wow, this is the future of cars. All cars are going to be electric. Now I get it. So electric vehicles are an example of the same sort of phenomena. I think that self-driving vehicles will do that with the artificial intelligence component. The ability to create your own art and music, I think, will be transformative. We're sort of just getting there now, so not many people have this experience. But once this becomes wider spread, and we realize we can, each of us, generate this content, I think that's likely to be quite transformative. People who have had that experience have come away, thinking it's really amazing, and so I suspect that that's the case. Oh gosh, I have one other thought here. It'll come back to me in a minute. What was my other example? I had another example. It slipped my mind at the moment. It'll occur to me in the next 5 minutes, and I'll bring it back up.
Yeah, just on the note of DALL-E and generative art, it's interesting the way it's already become a part of the MetaUni community, actually. So it's quite often, there's like 4 or 5 of us who have access to it, and it's often pictures are often thrown into conversation, just as a in the way. Yeah, it's hard to think of an analogy, really. I mean, I guess that's how memes work in general, but it's not that you easily produce them. I mean, you could just be chatting and then make one of these images and then throw it in. It's quite interesting. And there's a class running at the moment on category theory that's being taught by Billy, one of the people doing the most behind the scenes to make MetaUni work technically, and Will, who's a PhD student of mine. And the talk he gave on Monday, as a way of illustrating one of the kind of conceptual points, he'd noodled around a bit with DALL-E and made some images, which then he shared. It's interesting. It's a new texture in human experience. It's very interesting to watch unfold.
Well, it is. I mean, in a way, it's like waving a magic wand. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And as with many things, it was anticipated by Star Trek. There's a Star Trek: The Next Generation episode with some interesting social commentary about it. It's not a great episode. It's largely a forgettable episode. But there is a moment where the Enterprise encounters, the crew of the Enterprise encounters a culture. I don't remember the exact details of it, but a child is using a tool that allows them to carve out of wood anything in their imagination. So anything that they can picture in their mind, they use this tool and it just carves it for them. And so this child effortlessly carves a dolphin. And the Enterprise crew criticizes this as cheating, basically, and because it doesn't require the development of any skill. It bypasses that. And there was some interesting social commentary around that. And it's funny, of course, this was 30 years ago. It was in the early 1990s, maybe late 80s. I don't know exactly which season of The Next Generation it was, but fairly prescient. And now here we are. We have very, very similar capability now. And I think in the episode, it was literally a tool. It looked like a magic wand. You just pointed it and it carved up this thing. That's a bit what it feels like. And people who've used that, it suddenly, I suppose metaphorically, people must have felt like that the first time they had a digital calculator, right? And you just magically produce these results effortlessly. And, people spoke derogatorily about, how that crutch was going to hobble people intellectually, and when are you're not going to always have a calculator in your pocket. Of course, now we do, and won't be long before they're probably better integrated into our, closer to our brains. But at any rate, that does remind me of that. I did think of this other example, and that is, I think when people engage with a genuinely useful personal assistant, that will be a transformative experience. My understanding is that this is quite close in lab environments now. So, I mean, you can use sort of Siri and Google right now, voice activated assistants, and it can do quite impressive things. I mean, you can with your typical OK Google kind of questions and commands, you can get an amazingly good result. It's extraordinary what capabilities are there. But the quality of the interaction is not quite at, it's not fooling anybody that this is something that might pass the Turing test, right? But I don't think we're that far. I think the next generation if it were rolled out based on new language models and stuff, and things that are being demonstrated in labs right now, probably that require too much horsepower to deploy to millions of people simultaneously, millions of users. Those are coming, obviously, and I think that when you can properly have a conversation across a wide range of topics and ask questions in a fluid, natural language manner, and the personal assistant can keep track of multiple, a complex chain of thought and multiple ideas, and not get lost and remember things you said 2 minutes ago and that kind of thing, which you can't do right now. I think that's going to be a transformative experience for most people when they experience that for the first time. And I think for the policymakers, yes, fusion and military applications, those are going to be profound. For the public, when they get in a car that can drive itself, and when they can talk to Google in a completely natural way and have a conversation, and it is not making dumb mistakes, but is remembering, what you said a couple minutes ago, and is basically following the plot, that is going to mass, in my mind, it won't take that many people having those experiences to really shift the Overton window, to shift the perception from the long to the medium to the short timelines.
Yeah, I'm curious. I guess we're jumping to the public version, and that's fun. I can see all of those things moving people to medium timelines, but I feel like the takeaway from all of those things has a rather different feel to it than what I think short timelines feel like, because all of those things, they sort of feel like computers just better, So a car that drives itself, or generative art, or a personal assistant, yeah, it feels like Star Trek, I guess. But the AI in Star Trek is not really an AGI. It's like the computers in Star Trek are just the kind of things you imagine computers doing if computers were really good and could actually do the kind of things that you sort of naively expect computers to be able to do, perhaps. I don't think it's automatic that shifts you to really even believing necessarily in AGI, as opposed to just, I don't know, I'm not able to put a finger on the distinction, but I feel like it raises your estimation of just pervasive, very useful computation, but doesn't necessarily trigger a kind of existential angst or kind of fear of the unknown or the alien mind about to change the nature of your social and economic reality. That those things seem separable, and will likely be separated, in the sense that you don't want to, if you're making self-driving cars or any of these other things, you don't want your marketing to make people feel that your products are the cutting edge of a blade that will slice your world in half.
Yeah, it's interesting. Star Trek is sorry to lean on that as a cultural touchstone and harbinger, but it was interesting that the both the original series and then the next generation, and I presume subsequent ones, which I don't know as well. Those television shows always distinguished the computers, which were, as you said, very sophisticated, like the main computer on the Enterprise. Anybody could talk to it at any time, and it was pretty conversational. It had a janky voice in the original 1960s version. I think for the benefit of the viewing public, would have been a bridge too far to get them to believe that the computer would speak completely naturally. But by the next generation, in the late 1980s, early 90s, the main computer in the Enterprise is completely conversational. But there was always the idea that it wasn't sentient, it wasn't agentic, it did not have any goals, just was, functioned basically as an oracle. It was very capable, like you said, but there was always a distinction between that and AGI that was genuinely self-aware, sentient, alive. And then there was a lot of hay made about that with, for example, Commander Data, and there's some fantastic episodes covering the question of personhood and that sort of thing. But there was always a distinction there between those two ideas, between sort of a general intelligence that was self-aware and sapient, and when it wasn't. And I suppose my three category schema comes from, it's just borrowed. I should probably be just citing Star Trek, not any not any academic papers or any popular books or anything been written recently. But I'm sure it goes back to that. It's funny now that I think about it. But having said that, I even as a kid, I always found that a bit ridiculous. And I lumped it in with other things that were just conceits of the needs of storytelling, right? So like the technology of the transporter, it doesn't make sense. And half the things in the show don't make sense in the context of that technology, right? I mean, it doesn't make a lot of things don't make any sense at all. If you have matter, energy, perfect matter energy conversion and assembly and disassembly and so forth. But you just accept it as a conceit. And so it never made sense to me that a computer could be powerful enough to do the things that the main computer did on the Enterprise, and that it wasn't self-aware, and that it didn't completely transform everything about society. So I suppose until we have it, you're probably right. There's no reason to expect naively. There's no reason to expect that people will be concerned about this. We'll simply accept it in the same way that we accepted the distinction on old episodes of Star Trek. And yeah, computers can do these things, but they're not really alive. They're not really self-aware. They don't really have priorities and goals. How much they're not going to change things that much. I suppose the cynic, the cynical view is that position, right? That the public won't shift all that much. And yeah, I don't know. I suppose at the policymaking level, we should talk more specifically about the military applications, because drones is only one. I can think of a number of other ones, and those can have profound influence on the elites.
Yeah, let's do that. I think that's one of the most noticeable outcomes of the Ukraine conflict. Actually, is the way the discussion around this shifted. Before the conflict, I mean, I guess there was the earlier conflict in Azerbaijan, if I get that right, where drones played some limited but potentially decisive role. Didn't pay enough attention to form a judgment on that, but certainly it was described that way by some observers. And there's a lot of activity in the Middle East. These attacks by Israel on Iranian targets, for example. I mean, of course, drone warfare is at this point decades old, right? The US military has been making extensive use of drones all over the place for a long time. But these are remote operated largely and automated to some degree, but not, I would say, very large consumers of advanced AI, in my understanding. But even small drones, auto stabilization and auto target tracking and being able to move over long distances and correct for wind, and there's an increasing amount of AI that's going into these systems, and eventually they will be largely automated. This seems to be really picking up pace the last few years. I don't know what. It's not clear to me there's going to be some decisive moment there in terms of shifting the elites to a short timeline.
Well, one thing that's happened is that uh, science fiction, popular entertainment has done a pretty good job for a very long time of imagining some of these, dystopian military applications of artificial intelligence, right? So the again, Star Trek, of course, has, the original series had episodes. The Next Generation definitely had episodes. There were a couple of quite funny ones. In the original series, there was, the Enterprise encounters a world where, the all the conflict is fought by computers, and then the casualties are just reported,
Right.
the results of the simulations, and the populations go and incinerate themselves accordingly to the results of the simulation, so that they don't get the infrastructure damage. I mean, crazy but hilarious and funny social commentary there about the absurdity that you could get to if you were letting AI fight your wars. Next Generation had one about an episode about drones, and how a drone program was demonstrated, and then it wiped out the entire planet's population. And the Enterprise crew gets there, and they finally realized that to shut down this drone system, they have to agree to the sale. And so okay, we're sold, we'll take the system. And then, of course, the demo shuts down. So this, and then famously, War Games, the movie where the AI is running the nuclear, the Cold War simulations and things. So there's been some very famous treatments of this, and I think that, again, public awareness is there, and permits the elites to think about this stuff seriously. In my mind, the robotics and drones, yes, those are important, but I'm thinking the AI applications more in strategy and planning, and actual command of things. That strikes me as something that has the potential to be really have quite a profound impact on policymakers. Because if you have AI that can do the planning, the war, and do the war fighting, and figure out where and when and exactly how to deploy things efficiently and actually succeed, basically to play StarCraft, but in real life, in a way that no human possibly could. Well, you'd be unbeatable, right? That'd be an enormous strategic advantage if you could not be defeated, except by another AI, strategizer. And so
I think that kind of presumes a large proportion of the military force is itself robotic or automated. I don't know that it. I don't have a good mental model of how AI planning really makes deploying existing military assets much more efficient. I mean, is it really the case that an AI would just be much better at placing your battleships and your aircraft carriers? I mean,
yeah,
maybe if there are a lot of automated systems on those platforms, like automated defense turrets or some kind of drone defense umbrellas, or once the complexity of the systems, becomes very high, I can imagine there are combinations there that just aren't intuitive to a human, which makes sense. But I think I have a mental model where you need a lot more complexity and computation and automation in the battlefield itself before the planning part really makes sense to have an advantage from AIs. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Well, that's quickly approaching, of course.
Oh, hey, one thing occurs to me we haven't mentioned already. This is an interesting example, and that is in finance and trading.
Oh yeah.
So I know that there's been an algorithmic trading for a long time. I remember with friends in college long ago dabbling in those ideas, 20 plus years ago. It was definitely something that people were thinking about. Oh, how do we do this? I mean, if only we could figure out how to do. And algorithmic trading has become, obviously a big deal. It's very popular. But what hasn't emerged apparently is, an AI that just mops the floor with everything. and it just wins. And I actually find that I'm a little surprised by that. I heard some rumors that Google had developed some approaches that were shockingly successful, too successful to deploy, because they would have been dangerous to actually implement. Would have been. I'm trying to avoid using the word disruptive, but I heard that was. I don't know if that's true or not. But frankly, I'm sort of surprised that hasn't happened.
Well, I know personally somebody who's employed basically to write deep RL algorithms for a Googler who's moonlighting as a hedge fund. Like he wants to start his own investment company, and he's paying a friend of mine to write the AI that does it. It's moderately successful, but like all these things, it will fall over in some way and lose all your money. I think that's kind of, from talking to a few people who are in the field, many people can come up with very impressive demos, especially on historical data, and then maybe even on some limited amount. But then it's the out of equilibrium, sort of very sharp transitions that just lose all your money. That's the problem with any trading strategy, of course. I'm not saying anything original, but it's not so clear that there are good. I mean, for algorithms that learn from large quantities of data and see signals in there, it's not always the case that you would expect them to be particularly good at trading. It's not only about extracting signals, right? So yeah, I'm not familiar with any public examples of highly advanced AI being used, but I assume they're out there, and we just, there's just 100 of them, so it's not like any one has a decisive advantage. But I can assure you that plenty of hedge funds and individuals have tried their hand at making transformers do trading, for example. There's no way that hasn't happened. I mean, there are published papers about it. I guess nobody's made it. Well, I don't know. Who knows where, say, Renaissance makes their money at this point? It could be 20% transformer models doing the training. That would absolutely not surprise me at all.
Yeah, I suppose this is another question, which is in many of these applications, there is incentive to stay in stealth, right? There's incentive to be opaque rather than transparent, and so there are the motives, the incentives are to keep information from the public and that runs directly contrary to the process that we were talking about of the public becoming aware sooner rather than later as a benefit. At least I think that's implicit here, and we can ask that question explicitly. I think implicitly, I've been assuming that it's better if the public realizes the imminence of AGI, at least it seems to be imminent to me, and shifts at least from the long to the medium scenario, if not from the medium to the short. And I think they would be beneficial, even if we were wrong about it. I actually think it would be beneficial anyway, because I think we would adopt a different posture and make investments and decisions differently in ways that would overwhelmingly be to the good. But that's it's an assumption. It's not. We haven't defended that.
That's because we're naive, idealistic dinosaurs, Adam, that actually believe in the Enlightenment and boring old shit like that.
We obviously have to admit that not every example of a trigger is something for which there are incentives to be as transparent as possible about it. For self-driving cars, obviously there is, and for these other sort of services that would be deployed to market and would be very profitable if as soon as we can get the technologies working. But some of them, obviously, the military applications, some of the finance applications, we can think of maybe other ones where it would be, be very advantageous to be secretive about having this as either a competitive advantage or a strategic advantage or something like that. One can imagine, and one could also imagine examples of technologies that are that perhaps are too dangerous to allow out into the wild at all. There've been a handful of examples like that, like nuclear weapons technology and some biotech, bioweapons, bioterrorism applications of certain technologies.
That's a good example. Yeah, I didn't think about synthetic biology. That's another area which is already seeing rapid gains from this kind of tech. Yeah, maybe it's worth distinguishing just sort of slow, steady progress. Now, slow, steady progress almost by definition can't shift you from medium to short timelines, because short timelines means 10 years or something, and that's not short. That's not slow, steady progress. So we're talking about, let's be clear about how radical, transformative, disruptive, and crazy short timelines are. Right? It's easy, since we've been talking about it for a long time, and we've sort of gotten used to the idea, to underestimate just what a shitstorm it will be if elites, let alone the public, shift to short timelines. This will be a complete mess. Maybe transformative, good, chaotic, good, but a big mess. This will be very significant if people shift to short timelines. That means prices will do crazy things, right? Expectations. Okay, to take one example, I have a 30-year mortgage, right? What the hell is that about? Why is anybody getting mortgages anymore? Go get a mortgage for a $5 million house. In 10 years, there's no such thing as money if you believe in short timelines. Well, who the hell knows what money is worth? There's Google bucks. So there's some sense in which, if you believe in short timelines, you should probably go out and get like a super huge mortgage and invest it in land, because land will be the only rare thing anymore, and you'll just make mega bucks by doing that. So there's stuff like that where it's really it's not a small deal to believe in short timelines. All the downstream things of that belief are very disruptive. I think finance is a good example. So what would be a kind of sudden indication that stuff is getting real in finance? Might be something like the hyperscalers, by which one usually means people like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, to a more limited extent, Apple, people with thousands of GPUs at their beck and call. If someone cracks applying, if someone cracks AGI, and with 1,000 GPUs, you can make predictable returns at very high rates on the market, and we see that happening, I think that would certainly move elites to short timelines, right? If it can be done in finance, if it can be done in markets which are viewed with such reverence, then people will conclude that it's going to happen everywhere else. That seems like a pretty good indicator, actually. Maybe that we're already there, but certainly you could expect that before it arrives, there will be indications that take the form of strange market behavior. I think that's a good example, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good example, too. I think we should probably distinguish two, maybe there's stages or degrees of awareness. So there, at least when I when I model this in my imagination, I see 2 degrees of. So it's one thing to sort of entertain an idea seriously, but still only intellectually. And it's another thing to so fully grok an idea and onboard it and internalize it that it actually has it has an impact on your behavior. And then maybe there might even be a third degree as well, where it totally changes your worldview, all of your priorities, reshapes all your values, changes how you see the entire world, and really, really alters your behavior. So there might be even sort of a tail at the end of that second degree that almost qualifies as a third category. But I can definitely imagine when I, again, as I said, when I think about this when I model this in my mind, the public could sort of declare, like, you could have a lot of people, you could have a preponderance of the population, the majority of the population sort of declaring that they get this, and it could show up on surveys, and you could survey do you think there's a 50% or greater possibility that machines could be generally intelligent in 2030? I bet if you ran that survey right now, a lot of the public percentage would be pretty high. But that doesn't mean people really take it seriously enough to act on it. And so I think I don't think that's a meaningless distinction. I don't think it's like a distinction without a difference. I think that's actually a big deal. And so the one does obviously lead to the other, I think. But I don't think the world goes like completely bananas until people are really so serious about this that they're acting on it. And I don't know how large a number of people have to be, seriously entertaining the idea intellectually before, you get some critical mass of people taking it so seriously that they're altering their life plans, and as a result, and like they're not putting money into their retirement accounts anymore, but they're instead like partying like it's 1999. I think that's worth distinguishing. That it feels like that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, I agree. I guess the purpose of a fire alarm is a good analogy in this context, right? I'd never thought about fire alarms like this before I saw it written down, but it makes so much sense when you think about it, where there's kind of social permission to give a shit about a thing that is given by alarms. So people, apparently, who knows whether to trust these kinds of experiments ever again, but there's supposedly experiments where you sit people in a room and you can put smoke under the door and they won't do anything about it until there's kind of like social permission to be freaked out by the smoke, so that people can be sort of aware of something and aware. I'm not excluding myself from this, right? Maybe I would care about smoke, but you could take some other example. People that can be aware of a thing and intellectually believe it's significant, but not make that connection to behavior until there's some kind of prompt where you look around and everybody cares and is paying attention, and then suddenly the whole crowd is running out of the room because, well, they heard the alarm, and then that's what you do when there's an alarm. So yeah, I think that's right, that when we're talking about these kinds of decisive events and making these lists, I'm thinking of them as being kind of serving that alarm purpose, which catalyzes that shift from sort of, kind of being familiar with the facts to finding them deeply salient.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And just to kind of maybe, I don't know if this is useful or not, but to stretch your metaphor of the fire alarm, when the alarm goes off, in the case of a fire alarm, under some circumstances, I mean, the whole reason why you do a training, for example, and do fire drills is so that you get up and walk calmly in the right direction, and you know where the exits are, and it's reasonably orderly. If people don't do if people don't do any training, and they get caught unawares in some strange circumstances, they just panic, get up, scream, start running in circles, complete chaos, don't know what to do, don't know which action to take. They know they can recognize that it's an emergency, but okay, now what do we do? And so there's exactly right. I mean, is that what sorry, I just see what you write on the board there. Yes, the AGI arrive and humans move calmly to the exit.
That's our purpose in life, Adam. We're going to the exit will be dignified, at least.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Maintain your dignity at all times.
I guess. Let me see if there's anything I wanted to add on the elites to short timelines. I mean, we mentioned this before. I don't know how much we want to get into it. It's kind of the most widely Oh, yeah, I was about to mention things to do with Taiwan and military conflict, but actually something more interesting occurred to me earlier, which was, um, which I've now forgotten. No, it's gone. All right, so let's go on with that. Yeah, I mentioned nationalization of the hyperscalers or Google as a kind of provocative possible event. Uh, I guess in America, you think you're not allowed to call it nationalization. You say like production guidelines or something. So in the Second World War, I'm not aware that many industries were officially nationalized, but there was the War Production Board and a lot of coordination of producers and something like an allowed profit. I don't know to what degree things were really directed or whether it was nationalization in all but name. You may know better about that, but I could certainly imagine that something like that happens as a result of elites shifting to short timelines. I can't imagine that the trajectory will be left uh, to the whims of the increasingly disliked nerd barons if the elites in Washington shift their views to short timelines. I think there'll be some kind of moves to, if not nationalize, then have something like a war production board that is directing how things go.
Yeah, it seems to me that seems very likely to me. And I mean, we have talked a little bit about these. What would we expect, and does the increase in repatriation of key cutting edge AI related technologies, hardware especially, mark the beginning of a genuine arms race, an explicit arms race towards the prize of artificial general intelligence. What we're seeing now, does that sort of fit the bill? Is that what we would expect to see? And one can easily imagine a war production footing being mounted if the Overton window shifts any further or continues to shift in the direction of sort of imminent arrival of this technology in the short scenario. I would very much expect that sort of that sort of thing to occur. One question we might ask is, let's assume that that's necessary. Let's assume that the seizing control over the production of key hardware, so basically GPUs and chips and that sort of stuff. Assume that that's necessary for victory for say, for example, the United States. If it decided, okay, it's on, we got to win this, we have to do this, we have to seize control of production. What would that look like? What would we expect that to look like if it were not explicit? Could we predict in advance the actions that would be taken under some other plausibly deniable guise, some other policy, some other initiative? What would we expect here? And it would be fun to try to imagine sort of the plausible smokescreen kind of reasons or excuses that a government might give if it didn't want to give the real reason for this. And so, what might it be? So, if the government decided to suddenly do some massive procurement, draft for mathematicians. There you go. That's more on the software side of things, obviously. But like, what might we expect? What would that be done in the name of if it were not explicitly done in the name of winning the AGI arms race? What excuses could the U.S. government give for deciding to purchase, some substantial fraction of, the chip maker's output, and taking control of that? It would be something. Yeah,
I think it's pretty blatant in the more recent chip regulation. They're sort of just saying it out loud. I don't know why they would bother hiding it. I mean, I suppose you could look to the Cold War again for a very good example of that, right? It's the positive vision of. I feel very much like history is repeating itself with that, right? The positive vision of let's go to space and go to the moon and is coupled to this kind of very zero-sum attitude of let's bankrupt the Soviet Union, and it's almost the same without the positive vision part so far for AI, right? Where the chip regulations are clearly intended to basically say to China, okay, well, you want to keep up, then you better spend a big chunk of your GDP trying to keep up. And it's not like anybody thinks that's impossible, but the costs imposed on the Chinese system are viewed to be severe enough that maybe it'll disable them or something. So yeah, the positive vision part is missing. You're right. That's an interesting observation, that you'd expect that hole to be filled some point soon with a kind of national effort to build AGI to solve climate change, or build AGI to end aging, or build AGI to, I don't know, some progressive priority. Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I remember. Sorry to switch back. I remember the thing I wanted to say, which is it's worth giving a kind of microeconomic model of what this elite shift in opinion looks like. So I'm sort of privy to conversations among some of my friends who are in areas like pharmaceuticals, and hearing about their career decisions. And there's like all these shifts going on where a lot of venture capitalists are putting up lots of money to fund new biotech startups and new pharma competitors that are kind of AI first. Isomorphic Labs from DeepMind is one of them, but there's a huge zoo of them arriving. And the young people sort of are all, and some of the older people, but a lot of young people are making their bets on these new approaches. And this is kind of what elite shift in opinion looks like. The old adage about people don't change their minds, they just die. And a new generation comes along. I think new generations of elites just win by making bets on the new things. And what we'll see is those younger people moving into positions of larger influence and power as we move forward on this timeline. They're all making, I mean, the people who will be, maybe it's incorrect to say people will shift their mind to short timelines. It's more like in any given area of human activity, say biotech, there are large, well-funded groups of people out there right now who believe in short timelines. I know for a fact. I know some of them. And they are making their bets right now. And those bets will pay off or not. But when they pay off, they'll be the people running the show very rapidly, or they'll be co-opted, or, in any case, they'll move to the center of the frame. So maybe it's not actually accurate to think about it as the elites change their mind. It's more like actually the bets are laid. They're on the table out there, or will be shortly, and it's just the winners will step to the front as we move closer. If in fact short timelines are the true timelines, we don't know, of course.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable supposition. What I wonder then is so a couple of things. One is that in the case of the United States, the federal government, I suppose the state and regional and local governments to a much lesser extent, but especially the federal government is notorious for participating in and enabling the military-industrial complex. I mean, this is this is quite a familiar term to most folks, and it's certainly a key feature of the United States federal government and our national economy. We have massive budget of the federal government is devoted to defense and military applications, and a lot of that is very opaque. It's a lot of famously, $1,000 toilet seats and things like this to hide where the spending is actually occurring. But a lot of that spending is to private contractors, and so the government, although some research is done by the government bureaucracy itself, government agencies and institutions by government employees, and even some production is done by government agencies and government employees. But forever, including throughout the Cold War, a lot of that was done on a contract basis. So private companies were contracted, and I suppose there's every reason to believe that this is occurring now, could still occur, and that a lot of the U.S. defense black budget is going to the tech sector now, as opposed to the tech giants. Like, it certainly stands to reason that it would be going to places like DeepMind, in the same way that it went to sort of Lockheed Martin and McDonnell Douglas and Boeing during the Cold War to develop military aircraft and rocketry and weapons, ICBMs and et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't know how one would confirm that. I suppose having opaque accounting at these large organizations, at these large companies, would be one way. Like if you were getting very, very large government contracts to the tune of billions or tens of billions of dollars, and you were that was facilitating the procurement of massive supercomputing capacity and cloud capacity. Well, I suppose if you wanted to hide that, you could do it with, in a number of different ways with creative accounting. I don't know what we could make that as a prediction, and we'd have to say, okay, well, how would we confirm that? What sort of evidence would we need to see? I'm not sure what the answer to that would be. But it certainly wouldn't surprise me at all to learn that the major tech companies are receiving very, very large sums in exchange for contracts, and I'm using air quotes around that, basically just to do research and development of these key technologies. And whether that actually translates into a specific service or not, well, the government doesn't. The U.S. government has been vague about that in the past. So, yeah.
We'll have to wrap up there. That's 2 hours already, but that's
okay.
Good place to stop. Yeah, thanks everyone. It would have been better to stop a bit earlier to take questions or have discussion. Let's do that next time, but I have to move on to the next seminar, unfortunately, so I'll have to just love you and leave you. So
all
thanks
right.
everyone.
Well, we'll see you next week. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone.